All right. Welcome, everyone. Happy to see you all again today for our presentation. Again, I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History. And this is the third presentation of this week and the second series we're providing of webinars that explore the National Park Service's criteria for establishing World War II heritage cities. We are learning about the criteria for purposes of applications and evaluation by Park Service staff from the authors of our essay series on the topic. And Kathleen Madigan is kindly putting links to all of these resources in the chat for you. Today, we're going to be hearing again from Dr. Laura Oviedo on criteria 5, volunteer participation. As we are getting started, just a few housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded for those who can't attend and anyone that wishes to review the content. We will share recordings for this week's series of webinars early next week, and I will pop a link to the prior series recordings in the chat momentarily. Closed captions have been enabled for this presentation. If you don't see them automatically, click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please be sure to keep your microphones muted unless you've been called on to ask a question. And at any time, you can pop questions into the chat area of your Zoom screen, and we will work through them at the end of the presentation. And before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to give a warm welcome to Jason Okrasa from the National Park Service and to turn things over to him for some words of welcome.
Before I jump into my greetings, just so you know, Stephanie, Kathleen is not able to get into the chat, the webinar itself, just so you know.
Oh,
She
thank
just sent
you.
me an email. Okay. So under the section 9007 of the John Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act of 2019, the Secretary of the Interior may designate only one city per state or territory as an American World War II heritage city. The intention is to recognize and ensure the continued preservation and importance of the history of the United States home front in World War II. There are currently 18 designations as American World War II heritage cities. And as we've been mentioning all week, we're very excited the next couple of days to be able to add that. So keep your ears tuned to that. The legislation criteria includes two major areas. Number one, contribution by a city and its environs to the Second World War home front effort, and two, achievements by a city or environs to preserve the heritage and legacy of a city's contribution to the war efforts and preserve the Second World War II history. Within these are 15 topics pertaining to the war effort, contributions, preservation, and communicative activities. The NPS is very excited to partner with NCPH and the criteria authors and to explore these topics. We hope you catch our last presentation, which will be tomorrow. And with that, as already mentioned, thank you, Kathleen, for putting in our topic website, as well as putting our email in. So if you have any other questions, you can reach out to us personally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. And I see we have lost our speaker for today. So while hopefully she is getting logged back into our Zoom, I thought I would let you all know what tomorrow's presentation topic will be. It will be at and she's back. It will be the same time, and the topic will be diversification of the American World War II home front workforce. And now I am absolutely thrilled to be able to introduce our speaker for today, who is Dr. Laura Oviedo, who is an educator and public historian of the Latinx experience in the United States. Her research interests focus on Latinx civil rights, labor, belonging, and war. She's currently working on her first manuscript that narrates how national and hemispheric politics of race, democracy, and militarization shaped the lives of Latinas in Texas and Puerto Rico during World War II. Examining the roles of Mexican American and Puerto Rican women as servicewomen, military family members, factory workers, youth volunteers, and sex workers offers an opportunity to learn how the war had distinct effects on Latinas, especially Latinas living in a heavily militarized U.S. colonial territory. Dr. Oviedo's research has been supported by the Smithsonian Institution, Society for Military History, University of Texas Austin Center for Mexican American Studies, Texas A&M University, Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, among other institutions. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you again for joining me today. This is our third installment of the second part of the webinar series. I will be covering volunteerism and specifically USO and stage door canteens. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start. So USOs were authorized by President Roosevelt, and he authorized 6 organizations to come together to create the United Service Organizations, or the USO for short, on February 4, 1941. These included the Salvation Army, the Travelers Aid Society, the Young Men's Christian Association, the Jewish Welfare Board, and the National Catholic Community Service. In 1942, just less than a year later, actually a little bit over a year later, the American Wing Theater established the first stage door canteen in the basement of the 44th Street. These war activities, such as speakers, bureaus of victory players, and the famous stage door canteens. In total, 3,035 clubs and canteens were established during the war, providing a, quote, home away from home. During the war, 1.5 million volunteers put on comedy shows, musical performances, and dance mixers. They also provided services to help soldiers write letters to loved ones and even simple companionship for conversational or emotional support. USO and stage door canteens ability to boost morale, provide resources, and create a space of comfort and fun played an important role in sustaining soldier motivation during the war. For funding and volunteer, the U.S. relied on philanthropic contributions of money, goods, space for facilities, talents, and services. In its first year, the USO raised $16 million, which is a total of $250 million today. Between 1941 and 1945, they managed to garner a total of $33 million in donations alone. USO facilities were established through the efforts of communities who provided land, unused basements, churches, sleeping cars, museums, barns, and cabins. Communities got creative when it came to provide a space to host American soldiers. Hollywood and Broadway stars to everyday citizens volunteered their time and labor to make sure that American servicemen were being taken care of and catered to as an appreciation of their service. USO clubs offered an escape from their daily routines on military base. Depending on the funding and physical space of each club, the USO offered lounges for soldiers to relax and chat or enjoy a social session of cigarette smoking. There was also board games, books, and music that kept them entertained with friends and hostesses. Some even had boxing rings and punching bags for the occasional release of pent-up emotions or just a good old round of manly competition. Snacks and non-alcoholic drinks were also available for soldiers to enjoy. Clubs usually try to offer sweets that soldiers didn't have readily available on base. In Hawaii, for example, banana splits became extremely popular, and it said that they used 250 gallons of ice creams and countless bananas. Services that were offered were religious counseling, button sewing, and even if soldiers needed help writing letters, like I mentioned before, then USO volunteers would help. Other clubs offered sports tournaments, daycare services, and canteens, depending on the funding and support that they had. The USO didn't just serve soldiers at home, though. After the war began and troops were shipped all over the world, the USO followed. The group began to organize camp shows, entertainment extravaganzas that involved visiting entertainers who waived their fees for the tents to show their support for troops in person. The camp shows were a success, and they actually did a spin-off into their own nonprofit, which was the USO Camp Shows. I just wanted to add that in there, even though we're just focusing on mostly the stage door canteens and the USOs. These USO camp shows had started off as 7 trucks, basically providing like a traveling theater and live entertainment. And they eventually kind of sub-branched into taking care of different circuits of military need. They were separated by the Victory Circuit and the Blue Circuit, and they were the ones who entertained the soldiers statewide. And then you had the hospital circuit and the foxhole circuit, and they were the ones who were tasked with visiting the wounded and also the troops overseas. And this is where these camp shows is where you get Bob Hope, the Andrews sisters, and even John Wayne entertaining the servicemen. And if you go to museums, this is one of the most popular ways to that museums have used to showcase the efforts of artists, comedians, and different entertainers in these traveling exhibits and camp shows that they put on for service members. Between 1941 and 1947, 7,000 entertainers and 425,000 shows were attributed to the USO camp shows. One of the most iconic USO performers during World War II that you see on the right is Marlene Dietrich, who sang, danced, and performed comedy routines for USO camp shows and also in the Hollywood Canteen, which we'll get to in a bit. She participated in 500 USO shows, including tours in North Africa, Italy, Germany, and France. In the East Coast, the very first stage door canteen was founded in 1942 by the American Theater Wing, also known as the Wing, in Manhattan, New York. You can see a photo of that stage door canteen right here on the
Laura,
let's.
I don't want to interrupt, but we can't see your screen share.
Oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. Okay, give me. Let
No
me.
problem.
Oh my God. Thank you for letting me know. Let me share it. I think I got flustered with losing signal in the very beginning that I just forgot to share. Let me. Okay, are you able to see that now?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, well, let me just review. These are some of the photos on the right-hand side is where you see entertainer Dietrich performing. So in the slide that I was in right now, I was talking about the original stage door canteen created by the American Wing Theater, or the Wing, in Manhattan. Some of just like a brief, I guess, historical background into the Wing, or the American Wing Theater Service. Give me just a second. They were actually active even during World War I. They were already putting on shows, and some of those original members went on to again restart this during World War II, and they created this basically a committee of these women who decided that they wanted to service again American soldiers through their talents in Broadway. And so they made the first stage door canteen in the basement of the theater center of Manhattan, and you can see that in this photo right here. This was also known as a Broadway canteen. On its opening night, they welcomed 1,200 guests, and with the help of 275 volunteers. This included 200 actresses and actresses as waitresses, and 75 actors as busboys. The Broadway canteen was open 7 days a week for servicemen to utilize their letter writing services, eat some delicious pastries and other available food, smoke cigarettes, and watch shows. This historical marker that you see on the right-hand side is in Manhattan, New York, in New York County. It's in the theater district. It's on, the address is 200 West 44th Street. And you also have a photo of its present day condition as well. The inscription on the historical marker reads, "During all the combat days of the war between the United Nations and the Axis powers, the American Theater Wing Stage Door Canteen occupied this site. This tablet is dedicated to the men and women of the entertainment world who brought cheer and comfort to the soldiers, sailors, and Marines of America and her allies." On the West Coast, the Hollywood Canteen in Los Angeles, California. This canteen was opened 7 months later after the original one in New York was opened. This was opened on October 3rd, 1942. The West Coast followed suit and created a joint effort by stars like Bette Davis, John Garfield, and Joel Stein. Entertainment workers, from producers to agents to publicists, stylists, writers, they all helped feed soldiers by waiting tables, cooking and cleaning, depending on what they had available or what they were doing that day. Everybody occupied a different role. Celebrities like Rita Hayworth, Carmen Miranda, who was also really well known in the USO camp shows and traveling around not just the US, but even Latin America to promote goodwill between US and Latin America during this time. You also have Bob Hope, Roy Rogers, even Shirley Temple and Betty Gable would wait tables or dance on the floor, or you could see them dancing on the floor. And again, one of the most popular ones that you see here pictured in the left is Bette Davis, who's serving cake to US servicemen at the Stage Door Canteen. On their opening night, the Hollywood Canteen raised $10,000. They even sold $100 admission tickets for civilians to observe the USO entertainment and interactions on the sidelines. Warner Brothers even produced a film after the Hollywood Canteen starring Hollywood actor and future president of the US, Ronald Reagan. 40% of the film's profit went to the Hollywood Canteen. It was quite successful in the West Coast, and it's said that by the end of the war, they had entertained a total of 4 million soldiers. As far as other notable numbers of goods, they provided servicemen with 3 million packs of cigarettes, 6 million pieces of cake, 125,000 gallons of milk, and 9 million cups of coffee. Other stage door canteens could be visited in Washington, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco, Cleveland, and New York, and overseas in London and USO clubs. They not only provided servicemen company, conversations, and dance, they became a sole attraction for USO clubs. Hostesses were made up of women who belonged to women's clubs, community groups, school or religious organizations. They saw their roles as hostesses as an extension of the role and purpose in family life. They were extending their emotional labor and caretaking skills to make sure that the sons of America were being looked after and taken care of. There were 2 categories of hostesses, a senior hostess and a junior hostess. Senior hostesses tended to be over 35 years old and deemed, quote, respectable women in their communities. Their roles in the USO included volunteer work as receptionists, chaperones, committee chairs, counselors, and then they managed other daily tasks around the USO facilities, whether it was just maintaining it or making sure that the programming was running smoothly. One of the primary responsibilities of the senior hostesses was to chaperone junior hostesses, who tended to be between the ages of 18 and 30 years old. Sometimes mother-daughter duos volunteered as hostesses and it made it easier for mothers to keep an eye on their daughters. Junior hostesses were ultimately there to entertain the soldiers by jitterbugging with them on the dance floor, joining them for conversation and social games, and serving servicemen their desired non-alcoholic drinks and food. Senior hostesses made sure to keep an eye on the interactions between junior hostesses and servicemen to make sure that their social interactions and public behaviors abided by respectable standards. Junior hostesses or all hostesses were required to take an etiquette charm course specifically for them and taught them how to behave and how to act within these facilities. They were not allowed to date servicemen. They were not allowed to drink on the job. To some extension, USO hostesses, especially junior hostesses, contributions to the war effort was to prevent servicemen from engaging in immoralities, such as illicit relationships, going out to bars and getting drunk, and other immorally deemed forms of leisure. While the USO promoted values of democracy and equality for their clubs and canteens, they often avoided any controversies of race and class discussions. Sometimes the way they handled interracial mingling was by barring women of color from volunteering or creating segregated USO clubs in where Black servicemen could relax and Black women could volunteer. In an effort to provide African Americans access to resources and services provided by the USO, Hubert T. Daly, a lawyer and activist in the African community, was named as a board member in the USO Board of Directors. He was in charge of overseeing the services, accessibility, and entertainment offered to African Americans. To prevent total exclusion of African American servicemen, some locations opened segregated USO facilities. One example is seen here in Rolla, Mississippi, on the left-hand side of the screen, near Fort, quote, Lost in the Woods, where the segregated USO clubs were only 400 feet apart. Today, the city of Rolla has historical markers to honor both the Black and white USO clubs. So if you look here on the left-hand side, you see the historical marker for the Black USO. And then you also see the historical marker for the white USO. In the West Coast, USO clubs in Tacoma and Spokane, Washington provided entertainment, leisure activities, and resources for Black servicemen. Despite being segregated, the Black USOs were crucial to Black soldiers' morality as they faced harsh conditions and discrimination in the military. The Washington Carver USO in Spokane conducted a study where 44% of Black servicemen felt that the USO was, quote, absolutely essential, end quote, to their well-being. In Hattiesburg, Mississippi, the first USO club in 1941 attained 1,022 hostesses for its first all-white USO club that catered to soldiers from Camp Shelby. In 1943, they increased their volunteers by 800 volunteers. They eventually built a USO to host services and entertainment for African-American soldiers. As you see here on the left-hand side, that's the original site. Now it is, now that USO serves as the African-American Military History Museum. By 1943, of the total 1,326 USO clubs across America, 180 of them catered exclusively to African-American service members. For Mexican Americans in the United States, the USO was more exclusive for service members and volunteers alike. For Mexican American women who wanted to volunteer as USO hostesses, there were two major deterrents: discrimination and cultural ideologies of sexuality imbued within Catholic morality. Despite the, quote, respectable images of womanhood that USO campaigns promoted, the changing boundaries of women's role in society caused public concern and fear of sexual impropriety. Mexican parents were not too fond of having their young daughters unchaperoned and be in such close proximity to a number of men. As Elizabeth Escobedo writes in Coveralls to Zoot Suits, the racial malleability of Mexican American women allowed those in Southern California to exercise patriotism while enjoying personal freedom. For example, Rose Echevarria took advantage of her participation in the USO to meet and dance with men closer to her age because most men working on the home front were either too young or too old, according to her. Other women followed suit and used their patriotic duties to fulfill their own desires. This opportunity was not as readily available for Tejanas, Mexican American women from Texas. In the border town of Del Rio, Texas, this was about a few miles out from Camp Laughlin. Tejanas were not permitted to volunteer or enter a USO facility. And a strange turn of practice, even Anglo service members were refused to entry if they took company with Mexican women. Strict racial customs of miscegenation in Texas prohibited socialization between Anglo servicemen and Tejanas. These racial boundaries were upheld by local businesses and local and national USO. It was reported that businesses refused to serve Anglo servicemen from Laughlin Field who maintained friendly or romantic relations with, quote, Latin American girls whose background integrity and moral needs not to be questioned, end quote. Historian Megan Winchell demonstrates how the USO refused to interject in local matters when written complaints about discrimination made their way to its headquarters from a cosmopolitan club of Del Rio, which was operated by Mexican Americans. The USO didn't blink an eye because exclusion of Mexican Americans in Texas was, quote, rather common to border towns, end quote. Oh, let me explain the blank slide. I left this slide blank, one, because I wanted to include the history of Mexican Americans and USOs and kind of how they differ from California and Texas, how even regional politics plays a role in what's allowed in certain USOs. And so there's a stark difference between, what's being allowed in California and or in some parts of California and what's not allowed in Texas, with Texas having more stark, stark tensions between Anglo and Mexican relations. And, like African Americans, Mexican Americans in Texas during World War II were also segregated in most social and public places. And this didn't exclude the USOs as well. So when it comes to finding photos, when it comes to even finding anything really related to Mexican Americans in the USOs, it has been extremely difficult as a historian whose primary area of research is in World War II. It's been very difficult trying to find any type of participation of Mexican Americans, one in Texas because they weren't allowed. But one thing that I didn't include, I believe I didn't include this in my essay as well, was in some of my research, that I've been able to get hold of through the Voces Oral History Project, with some of the oral histories provided by Mexican American women who were youth at this time, was, there was, I believe, 3 individuals who were not considered USO hostesses, but they were allowed as a group of entertainers. As a group of entertainers to go into a USO club near Camp Swift in Bastrop, Texas. And they were dressed in the traditional Mexican, long skirts, and do traditional Mexican dances as a way to entertain soldiers. And so that was one of the only instances that I saw where Mexican American women were allowed to go into these USO clubs, but it was in the form of volunteers. It was as a form of entertainment. Despite the practices of segregation that I covered in some clubs, other USO clubs promoted racial democracy through interracial socialization and cooperation. In Philadelphia, Black servicemen were entertained, provided resources, and cared by both Black and white volunteers. In Tucson, Arizona, Ada McCormick, an upper-class white woman, became an ally to the African-American community and pushed for an all-white city council to fund and provide a USO facility for Black servicemen. She even published an op-ed in the local newspaper to address and to kind of challenge local citizens on their lack of USO facility for Black servicemen. And she, in that local newspaper, printed this really important major question was, was there lack of support for Black servicemen, quote, helping Hitler or helping America, end quote. One of the canteens that is exalted as a space of racial equality, or that tried to at least have or practice and demonstrate racial equality, was the Hollywood canteen. Even though USOs and these stage door canteens had the stage door canteens had a policy of non-discrimination that were established by the American Theater Wing. And to this point, it kind of makes it, the stage door canteens have been kind of presented as the first time where some of these African-American and Anglo-Americans, it was the first time that they were able to experience integration. But even though this was non-discrimination had been established by the wing, it also wasn't always practiced or overseen by the boards. Some canteens made sure that men and women danced with people of their own race, even though they were in an integrated area or an integrated facility. In Los Angeles, the Hollywood canteen welcomed Black composer and performer Margaret Bonds, who you see here on the right, and jazz musician Una Carlisle. This is another photo that I found with actor Spencer Tracy carving a Thanksgiving turkey for soldiers in the Hollywood canteen in November 1942. More than 1.5 million civilian volunteers gave their time to the USO during World War II. And through their service, they were able to uplift the troops and provide what we consider sustained soldier motivation throughout the war. In July, I touched on, I guess, all the major, kind of the good and the bad of the USO canteens, but I didn't quite touch on the some of the deaths that occurred as a result of some of the traveling aspects of the USOs, which included the camp shows. In July 1944, comedians Jane and Joe McKenna were captured by Germans and held prisoner. They were held for 10 days and then they were liberated. But it's also it's known that about 37 USO entertainers were killed during World War II. A far cry from the 3,035 USO clubs and canteens and the 1.5 million volunteers during World War II. As of 2019, the USO only has about 230 locations across the globe, with only 35,000 volunteers. So from 3,035 USO clubs in World War II to now 230 locations worldwide. the USO has seen a steep decline in the support, and some articles that have touched on this credit this to the lack of connection between civilian populations today and the military. This photo that you see here, the photo that you see here is part of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. When they open, they host the BB Stage Door Canteen, which is a live replica of the World War II USO canteen. This, if you haven't had a chance, I just had a chance to go, I believe it was this past March, to go to one of their live performances. And it's, I mean, I don't know what it's like to live in the 1940s, but it seemed like a really, the ambiance, the 1940s ambiance is definitely in there. And not only do they include performances, but they include happy hours, jam sessions with local jazz museum musicians, and other type of events to get the public to come and enjoy some of the 1940s ambiance of the Stage Door canteens. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Folks, feel free to use the raise hand feature to ask questions live if you want to be able to unmute, or drop your questions in the chat. I see there was one comment in the chat from Donna Graves that there was a separate Chinatown USO in San Francisco, but that she wasn't sure about Los Angeles.
Thank you. I'm going to look into that one.
Yeah. And while we wait for questions to come in, I'll just kind of get us started and ask, you know, is there some like fascinating fact or a bizarre piece of information that you came across, or just something that stuck out at you that didn't make it into the presentation, but that folks might find interesting?
One of those is, I wish I had the photo on hand of the little girls of Mexican American youth that were actually from Austin, Texas. These Mexican American youth who dressed up and went and danced in these USO facilities. But one of the things that I did find as I was doing this research, but even for my own, because this is this part of aspect of volunteer service is also part of my manuscript. So even doing research for that, it's been really, the research on USOs and these stage door canteens is very limited. So I feel like there's still a lot more room left for this research. There's a lot of blog posts and digitally available archives, which I love because they've been able to supplement a lot of the research that, you know, obviously we can't get in person, or, you know, and so that's been able to be a resource. These blogs and kind of these general pages on USOs have been a great resource, not only for me, but my students when I assign this kind of topic in class. But there is kind of literature on this topic is kind of spread between decades. So you have like a thesis in like the 1980s, and then the 70s, you know, 70s, 80s, and then a few books now that have been coming out, a lot more, but a lot of the literature that you see is very much, you know, relegated to maybe short articles or books. So I mean, I feel like we have a lot of research left to do in the vehicle for that.
Yeah. And where would you suggest, if folks are thinking about their own city nominations and thinking about this criteria, where would you suggest they look for resources in their communities on this topic?
I mean, from what I've seen, I mean, from what the kind of similar pattern that I've followed through the different essays that I've done, and this one is that a lot of these home front initiatives are very much localized and community oriented. right? So if they're not available in the state archives or in these very much larger institutions, archival institutions, I would suggest even going to, like I said, I think mentioned in yesterday's presentation, even looking at more what we consider like smaller archives, whether they're public schools, yearbooks, right? So I know that for San Antonio, at least, some of the information that I've been able to find have been through like school yearbook, something unexpected in a way. But it really shows how these kind of public educational institutions who were heavily operated and worked with wartime mobilization efforts really kind of used, whether it was a school newspaper or a school newsletter or even yearbooks, to kind of publish and elevate what they were doing in their campus on a very smaller region part. But yeah, I would suggest starting small there. Oral histories, I would say, are nuggets, but I mean, it's just really hard when a lot of this World War II generation is no longer with us. So that has unless it's already been collected, it's really hard to kind of go in through that. But the way that I was able to find some of these little nuggets of stories of these young women from Austin, Texas, going to Camp Swift was just going through oral histories that didn't even mention that they were entertaining for USO. They were categorized under something, something else under World War II. So sometimes these little nuggets of information come from, I'm pretty sure as research, you're going to find them in different, whether they're categorized into different themes or folders or type of participation efforts. It's just kind of the luck of the game when it comes to some of this research.
Thank you. And we have a question that just came in from Trevor Rice, who asks, have you found any similarities or interesting stories about how folks met these same leisure and recreation needs when they didn't have access to USOs, either due to race or some other reason? Was instead gathering at record stores, bars, restaurants, union halls, etc., seen as a poor substitute or a second-class activity? Were there similar or potentially more informal volunteer efforts to host service members at these other locations?
Yeah, so actually, you're bringing me to something that I actually left off of the presentation, and I mentioned it in my essays. But, Black women, African American women, during this time were really heavily involved with pushing for efforts to get facilities built for African American soldiers. And most of these were middle-class women. However, what they found was that a lot of, working class African American women, they didn't have the time to volunteer at a USO. So sometimes it wasn't just that they didn't have a facility, but they also didn't have the volunteers to come in and help. So what I did find was, yes, they did host like non-official gatherings, especially for African American soldiers. They had their own like recreational facilities. They weren't necessarily named USOs, but they had recreational facilities where they would gather, kind of the same gist of USOs. They would hang out for a company. You even had women from the community come and bring foods and snacks and drinks, and provided that kind of companionship, but without that official USO logo to sponsor them. So it was similar, and there's different volunteer efforts in that, but just not within the USO name.
That makes me wonder about how tribal communities and indigenous folks participated or didn't, or had access to these resources or didn't, or maybe recreated them. Do you have any, did you find anything related to that in your research?
No, so I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it goes also to what Donna Graves put up about how there was a separate Chinatown USO, right? So it makes me wonder, because a lot of the limited amount of research or information that's out there mostly covers the white and Black divide, right? In I don't know if you all are familiar with the, let me get the title of the book. It's Michelle, give me just a second. It's called Good Girls, Good Food, Good Fun. So this is one of the most important books on, I would consider it, as part of the that talks about the USOs. And this is where I was able to find a nugget about the Del Rio case, but it was just kind of, inserted in there. It was inserted in there, and as far as this was what gave me the case on Texas. In California, the only way I was able to get information about Mexican Americans and how they were allowed in California was in Elizabeth Escobedo's From Coveralls to Zoot Suits, and she mentions it in like less than a page as well, because that information is so scant. And so with kind of the lens of diverse communities, is too would be curious to see what we could, or what IGs or other non-African or non-white communities experienced during this time. But again, like, that research is extremely limited.
And that does remind me that we will be doing a third iteration of this webinar series. Another project that the National Council on Public History is collaborating with the National Park Service on, related to the World War II home front, is an update to the 2004 World War II home front theme study. And this update will specifically include chapters on Latinx history in the home front, Native American and Indigenous history on the home front, as well as disability history, LGBTQ history, and environmental history. And I'll be curious to see if the researchers on that project were able to uncover a bit more and might open some new connections to some research that's just starting to come out as we're telling them a more full story of the home front. So we'll definitely be sharing that information as it becomes available. But you're really making the case that there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, because when it comes to looking at Indigenous communities during World War II, when we think about, even looking at USO, the USO and the stage door canteen, a lot of the labor that went into it was very gendered, right? The emotional work, the just everything, the work itself was very, very gendered. And so, but of course, in in the essay, I think we were told, yeah, so I didn't include a lot of that gendered analysis in the essay to keep it at that level that, to present. And so but when it comes to Indigenous communities, like, we think about the types of roles they played and the relationship that they had with the United States at that time period, it kind of brings up, it makes me really think about how even their structure of gendered labor, how then that translates into USOs if they were to have their own, because what we see as, oh, women were doing this for the first time, for certain women, for them it wasn't something that was entirely new, or their gender divisions of labor are totally different. So I would wonder if they had their own USOs, or if they participated in USOs, how that translated, if that translated at all, or if they just stuck with kind of the same gendered work of the USO.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a question building on that conversation from Ian Wilder. speaking of the gendered work of USO, what acceptance or lack thereof was there for WAC and other service women within those spaces?
Very, very limited. This was basically for men, catered to male soldiers. I mean, if we look at the gendered, I mean, one, they didn't even want a women's Army Corps, right? One of the excuses, or one of the reasons that they were given for not accepting WACs, as far as even Puerto Rico, and this is through classified or declassified documents that I found, where they were asking, you know, will the military base in Fort Buchanan, will you accept Women's Army Corps service members in the base to help you all out? And some of the excuse or some of the justifications they were using was that it was unacceptable for women to be out late driving, to be out past certain hours, because it wouldn't look, it wouldn't look good to the public. One, they're already trying to make sure that the Women's Army Corps is viewed as this respectable, educated, very elite class of women, and having them out at late hours of the night or even socializing in public. They didn't want to risk the, to add more, how would I say, to add more negative rumors, because there was already slander campaigns going on with the Women's Army Corps. So I can only imagine when it comes to the USOs, I mean, even with the hostesses, they were already micromanaging their behaviors and the way that they socialized to make sure that they weren't stepping out of that stepping out and of these respectable ideas of behaviors. And so similar to USO hostesses, the WACs were also very much patrolled and policed. I know for some instances, they were not allowed to socialize with male soldiers because, again, they didn't want to bring attention or any kind of negative attention to them. So, yeah.
Thank you. And that raises a whole host of questions about how LGBTQ service members would make use or not of these spaces. So certainly lots more research to be done and hopefully new stories to be uncovered. If anyone else has any last questions, feel free to raise your hand or to pop your question in the chat. While we're seeing if we have any last questions, I'll remind everyone that we have one last presentation in this particular series that will be tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Central, and we'll be talking again with Dr. Oviedo on diversification of the American World War II homefront workforce. I want to thank you again, Dr. Oviedo, for giving your time to us today and sharing your research with us. I appreciate your time. Thanks to everyone who joined us today, and hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow to wrap out the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.